Hello and welcome to our lecture on industrialization. This is our online lecture on chapter 23, Industrialization and its Discontents. Industrialization is one of my favorite topics to discuss with students because it is something that we are still seeing the effects of in terms of what we would consider the industrialized world. And we can also see the effects of industrialization on other parts of the world that are now just becoming industrial. So in this particular context, however, we're talking about the industrialization and what is considered to be the actual industrial revolution, which takes place in the mid-18th century, starting around the 1750s through basically the First World War. So this date you see right here, 1914, is significant for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons is that it is the date for the beginning of the First World War, which we will spend some time talking about in the coming up weeks. So, excuse me, when we look at industrialization, we're going to see that it starts here first. And this is England, right? We've spoken a lot about England in our course, but England plays a very large role in industrialization, and it's the first to do so. And we're going to talk about why that is in a few minutes. But I just want to remind you of a few things in terms of the map. So here's England. It is an island off the coast of Europe, which is here. England will have colonies all over the world, including colonies in the Caribbean, both Canada and the US, or former British colonies, right? They also have colonies in Barbados, Jamaica, British Guyana. They will have colonies throughout the entire sub-Saharan Africa continent. They'll have, as we discussed, they occupy Hong Kong and other parts of ports of China. So industrialization, right, is going to work to help strengthen these colonial holdings all around the world. Other places that will industrialize following England are places like Germany, France, Italy, and the US, all of whom will participate in the First World War as well. All right, so I mentioned earlier that the British are the first to industrialize. So why is that? Right. What British historians will tell you is that, particularly British historians who are writing in the 19th and early 20th century, they will tell us that England industrializes first because it is superior to every other place. I wouldn't believe that if I were you. I would instead look at perhaps some environmental factors. So the first environmental factor is basically geography. England is an island. This is an island that happens to be or was sitting on top of lots of coal deposits that were naturally underneath the earth. So they did have that, right? They have what you see in the green spaces are coal fields. So coal will become one of the actual engines of the Industrial Revolution, one of the actual energy sources. And again, it's worth mentioning industrialization is defined as this movement from human power and animal power to machines and factories. In so doing, it's a revolution because it causes all of these other changes in society, which we will talk about as well throughout our lecture today. All right, but nonetheless, England industrializes first because of one of the reasons, right, environmentally, is because of coal in the ground. Another reason that we see industrialization happen in England is because by the 18th century, it has a fairly large population. England has a fairly large homeless population. It has already suffering environmental effects from cutting down all of its trees. It has a number of issues. So the high population is going to provide basically the labor and the very cheap labor for factory workers. So we have sort of geographical reasons, we have high population density, which has been growing throughout the years following the plague, basically. All right, so what develops here in terms of industrialized labor is also revolutionary. So here we go. Early industrialization, again, this first period for about 100 years, 1750 to roughly 1870. It begins first in England, right? One of the other specific factors is colonies. Colonies provided the raw materials for factories to make something out of those materials. So we talked about this before in terms of the Atlantic triangular trade, right? So England has colonies throughout the Americas. They are sending things like tobacco, sugar, let's see, certainly a little bit cotton, rice, indigo, chocolate, those types of raw materials to England. So their first factories will be factories such as a textile factory, which takes cotton, right, the raw cotton, and then makes it into something. So that something are things like curtains or clothing or drapery or upholstery for your chair. So overseas colonies, right, and Britain has the most, really sets you up for industrialization. And so it has that too. What we also see happening with industrialization is that it starts to change wages. So we start to see basically what we could call a professionalization of the labor market in a way that is, of course, revolutionary. We see the ascension of white-collar jobs, and these are jobs that demand a certain level of education. So these are things like becoming an attorney, becoming a doctor, an accountant, even a teacher at that point in time, high wage jobs. And you also have technical jobs in terms of skilled labor, semi-skilled labor, and unskilled labor, creating a three-tiered system of white collar, blue collar, and sort of working class categories for skills. All right. The other thing that is a very important characteristic of industrialism and the Industrial Revolution, of course, are actual technological changes. So the technology that we see developing during this time very much builds on existing technologies. All right. So one of the effects of industrialization in England was the creation of the factory system. Now, again, a factory is going to operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We will see the development of a wage labor, right? The idea that you make so much money per hour is something that grows out of this. The factory system is going to create a growing dependence on machinery to do the bulk of human jobs. Yes, humans are doing these jobs, but the factory is doing the majority of the labor. What's happening is a sort of automation of work. We also see the development of transportation. So these is certainly the railroad as the most visible sign of industrialization. With this comes vast urbanization. So urban centers are becoming easier to get to, certainly becoming more populated, and you're increasingly seeing things to buy. So for example, a city like England would have fruits from the Caribbean there that, again, you could only get in the city of London at these specific markets. They may have chocolates that are made from the cocoa beans that are grown in Jamaica, right? Tobacco. So the only place you're going to be able to buy tobacco for your basically pipes at this point in time it would be in these specific markets in a place like London. Otherwise, you just can't get it. Making people want to go there, making this place a center of finance and trade, right? Also making store owners wealthy, right? So, of course, the store owners are depending on plantation owners using slave labor to help keep their costs down. So all of this is very much predicated on the use of slave labor back in the Americas. All right. We also have railroads, faster ships, making transportation, of course, easier, cheaper, faster. And then, of course, you have the colonies. The colonies existed. Now we have the factory in Europe, in England running. So you have workers in England that are making stuff out of the stuff grown in the colonies, in which slave labor basically is used on these various plantations. So that's sort of the inner workings of the entire system of capitalism. It's creating capitalism. It's also creating England as the world's dominant political economy in the world at the same time. All right. So after England industrializes, right, to come back here, we see these other places start to industrialize as well. This particular British engineer, Samuel Slater, takes the factory system to the US. The first factories in the US will be textiles, just like in England. And that's, of course, similar to England. America has cotton plantations in the South. We will use the raw cotton that's cultivated out of enslaved labor, ship it up north, where it will be made into products to sell from laborers in the north. So that's how the entire thing is very much interrelated. Okay, so the second phase of the Industrial Revolution is sort of late 19th, early 20th century, 1871 to approximately 1914. Again, after the U.S. Civil War, in which the U.S. economy is obviously disrupted over 4 years of fighting about slavery, and if the South could maintain slavery with people of color being free in the North. And this created such tension, obviously, that the U.S. or that the South creates their own country based on slavery and tries to fight the U.S. And of course, the South loses. And this will end this Civil War in the U.S. After that, the U.S. goes through a period of rapid industrialization. That includes not only the railroads, shipping, you also see the beginning of skyscrapers. So the first skyscrapers will be in cities like Chicago, right, that are highly industrialized, have lots of railroad. And then you will see the creation of these other products. What's also really fascinating during this period, I think, is the development of chemicals. So new chemicals such as bleach, ammonia, heavy chemicals that are not only very damaging to communities, but also have a very significant public health and environmental factor. You also see the development of electricity, much of this coal-fired electricity, factories and cities, and then the combustion engine as a new, very powerful force in transportation. So a country like England, by this point, is all connected through the train system. The U.S. is becoming that same way. We are connected via railroad tracks by the end of the 19th century. Oops. All right. So what you see here is industrialized Europe by 1914. And again, why 1914? That is the beginning of the First World War, where war is going to break out all over the entire continent and in other places as well. So again, by 1914, most of Europe is connected via industrialization. Germany has become a nation state, so has Italy. As they are industrializing, they also want colonies. So all of these different empires are very much bumping up against each other, wanting more colonies around the world, creating lots of intrigue, drama, and leading to war in Europe. All right. So other things that are happening. Again, the technology at this point is also equally as fascinating. Later industrialism includes the telegraph machine. So now people are connected first through telegraph and then later through telephone. People are also connected through radio. They can send messages across the world. The other thing that is creating conditions for a global war is the technology and weapons technology that's being created, such as the Maxim gun or the machine gun. Once we have these new weapons of war, we will use them. We will kill each other in record numbers. So these world wars that break out in the early part of the 20th century will have unprecedented human losses because of the technology that it facilitates mass casualties. All right. So what is the social and economic impact of industrialization? Well, I'm so glad you asked. It does lead to population growth. This population growth also leads to urbanization. Now, there is a real negative impact in terms of public health and the environment because of industrialization, urbanization. One is poverty, certainly, and mass poverty, or what we would consider a concentration of people who have nothing in one specific area. With that, at this point in time, also came diseases, public health problems, tuberculosis, as well as questions over morality, such as, is it okay to put children of poverty in factories? Should they be in school? And of course, who pays for it? So industrialization will have these very profound social aspects to them. It also creates a type of migration, right? So as industrialization is happening throughout Europe and in America, because of mass industrialization in America, it's also creating waves of migration and immigration for people looking for alternatives and other ways of making money. The world's population during this time, particularly in the Americas, is really exploding. So Brazil, we have massive population growth. Australia, and what do all these things have in common? Australia, Brazil, the US, and Canada, of course, all former colonies, all colonized by major European powers in the 18th and 17th centuries. All right, and before. So how does then industrialization shape society? Well, we start to see, again, the creation of something known as the upper class, right? Industrial elites. These are people who own the factories or who own the land of the factories. These will be people with unprecedented wealth who now join sort of the royals in Europe as landed aristocracy. We also see again the creation of a new category of class of people, which is the middle class. These are professionals, these are business people, owners, but also people who may have had educational training to get there. Again, accountants, bankers, financiers, insurance, right? The idea of insurance grows out of slavery and capitalism. So there is sort of a professionalization of business, white collar business, that is adjacent to industrial society, and those people are profiting. The working class is also becoming a separate category. I don't know how many of you would fall into the socioeconomic class of upper, middle, or working, but these distinctions are still very much around in the 21st century in industrial spaces. All right. Most working class people lived in factory towns and cities. Most working class people lived in very small spaces, poorly ventilated. Again, there's no regulation of these things. There are very few building codes, very few regulations at all. So in this early part of industrial society, governments did not believe they needed to regulate buildings, regulate industries. And in so doing, people are becoming very sick. They are becoming poisoned by many of the things they are exposed to. And the government, again, operated out of a philosophy of not getting involved. This is known as laissez-faire economics. In a place like England, it's becoming so polluted, it gets the nickname of having London fog. That is not fog caused by nature. This is fog caused by industrial output of coal, right? So this is what this very famous picture, a drawing, is attempting to depict. All right, so as one can imagine, as society industrializes, people start to critique it. And one of the most significant being this man right here, Karl Marx. His critique of industrialization creates an entirely new economic philosophy known as Marxism. And he called himself a socialist. He believed that workers should have ownership of the factories they work in. He believed that if the labor of the factory gets basically some money back, they will have more investment, and that will create a more equitable society, right? Getting rid of rigid class hierarchy. He will advocate forming labor unions as well as forming political parties based off of labor unions, and this is known as a Chartist. These terms, bourgeoisie, right? A bourgeoisie is Karl Marx's term for the upper classes, and to some extent the middle classes, but certainly the upper classes. And he wants working class people and middle class people to basically share the wealth with upper class people, or who he calls the bourgeoisie. All right. So many people who get involved in the labor movement of the 19th and 20th centuries, these are the things they're asking for. Again, governments, the U.S. government, England, they don't regulate businesses, right? Workers had to force the government to maintain standards. So these are some of the things that they want. Laborers often ask for working conditions, reform, working conditions such as the idea of a minimum wage, that you should have exits available in case of fire, that there should be standards in terms of what dangerous chemicals you may be exposed to, right? There begins to be a call for those types of improvements. Some do begin to improve, and you also see an uptake in women, right? So by the beginning of the 20th century, many more women are working in jobs all over industrial spaces. And of course, this is going to go hand in hand with women's rights, because if you don't have the right to vote, you are very much locked out of the economy that you are actively participating in as an industrial worker. So here's an example of women in the workplace from this advertisement in France. These are women who work for the telephone company. And again, it shows you sort of a professionalization of labor in this way. All right. So what are some of the improvements, right? Industrialization does create some positive changes in society. And we can look at those as well. Living conditions begin to improve. During this time, we see the establishment of public water systems, better sewage inside and outside of plumbing, and better control of diseases, and the use of new chemicals to treat water to help with diseases. You have the spread of electricity, making lighting safer and much more affordable. Eventually, you have the creation of an 8-hour day, a minimum wage, which is going to allow for people to have more leisure time than they had in previous, before industrialization, or at least that's the argument. You can certainly make a different argument if you chose, that pre-industrial people have much more time than industrial people. All right. So like I said, this is creating the culture of capitalism, or a big business culture. We are currently in the U.S. living in another age of billionaires, where we see extreme gaps in income equality. And the same would be true in the late 19th century. You see the creation of very large corporations that come out of the result of no regulation, or again, laissez-faire policies. Companies have tremendous wealth. They have tremendous influence, both politically and economically. You see the rise of billionaires, right? Men who control entire industries all on their own. This is also a time of great interest in science, great interest in technology, as well as the idea that you could create the most productive type of worker. And this is known as Taylorism. Oh, sorry. Certainly, I apologize about that. Oh gosh, I have to cut this off. I'll start it back in just a second.